Hey, curious people. You're listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the self-led sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. Lots of people worry about sex or don't feel as in control of their sexual behavior as they might like to. When do these thoughts or behaviors cross over into OCD, or obsessive-compulsive disorder? On today's episode, I had the great privilege of talking with Melissa Mose, certified IFS therapist and OCD specialist. She helps us know what OCD actually is and how it can impact relationships and sexuality. We discuss how IFS can be helpful in restoring a sense of sexual choice and freedom so that folks can feel self-led in bed. Melissa Mose is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice in Los Angeles since 1995. She has specialized in the treatment of OCD and anxiety since 2011 and currently sees clients, trains, and supervises associates, and does consultation with licensed therapists. Melissa is IFS Level 3 trained and is an IFSI approved clinical consultant. She is also president of OCD SoCal, a nonprofit affiliate of the International OCD Foundation. Melissa's experience as the parent of a child with OCD led her to specialize in the treatment of individuals with anxiety and OCD, as well as their families. She has a unique approach that integrates the evidence-based processes of OCD treatment with the transformational healing of internal family systems. Please join us for this fascinating conversation. Welcome, Melissa. I'm so excited to have a chance to talk with you. And I'm just wondering, what parts you're noticing as we step into this space.
Well, just a lot of gratitude, first of all. I'm excited to be here. I really appreciate that you invited me, and it's always fun to talk about this for me. I have another part when we talk about my family history coming to this, that I always like to thank my daughter for being willing to let me talk about her in public. And I think it's always nice to name that's with permission. And I'm very curious to see how these how our topics are going to overlap, and there's a lot of, I think there's a part that feels like I don't know where it's going. So that's,
Yeah. How is that? What's that like for you to feel like the uncertainty of not knowing where it's going? If I could ask.
Yeah. How is that? It's exciting, actually. I think I get more worried when I'm supposed to be really prepared for something, and I worry that I'm going to forget. So, here it's exciting to just sort of look at the path ahead and know it will meander. I feel like I should know more about what you do. There's that part.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling I will.
Yeah. Well, welcome to that part, and welcome to all your parts. And I asked that question about uncertainty because I believe that's kind of a theme with OCD too, right? Like the parts I notice in my system that come up around preparation, knowing how things are supposed to go. It's coming up for me in the early days of starting this podcast, even, that I should know how this is going to go, what's going to emerge from it, what the outcome will be, and other parts that are so excited about the potential and just letting things unfold and seeing, how things go. So just resonating, I think, with what you're naming. And also with the part that says you don't know enough about what I do. And I have a part that when it comes to OCD, as much as I have worked with clients with OCD, I can share there's some OCD in my family. There's always a part of me that feels like, I don't know if I really get this. So that part is curious. And I also just want to say that one of the reasons I was so excited to talk with you is because I see OCD type parts, so parts that are obsessive, parts that have compulsions come up a lot around sexuality in my work. And sometimes it took a while it was kind of a huge light bulb when I realized, oh, I don't think we're only talking about the topic at hand. When people will come in with a sexual problem, like, I don't know if I'm attracted to my spouse, or, I just am sure that my penis isn't the right size and it's not good enough. Or it could be anything, people's concerns about sexual orientation, but it wasn't only about that. It felt like initially we would be approaching these things the way I typically would. And then there seemed like a stuckness, and like the story of their life history didn't quite lead to the conclusion that it seemed like the part was really stuck on. So I've always been interested in OCD as it plays out, and there's lots more to say about all of this, which hopefully we'll get to more of it. But those were some of the things that I was so interested in when I first heard you speak at the IFS conference, and I'm just excited to have a chance to just flesh things out a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's so exciting because this is a huge issue, and it's not, we relationship OCD is a type or subtype of OCD where people have obsessions about their relationship and they compulsively try and figure it out and be certain, various different aspects. But in terms of the people that I work with, it's not just in that area. People have issues with sexuality when they have contamination OCD. People have issues with sexuality when they have harm OCD. Just right. I mean, so it really is kind of across the whole spectrum of these OC systems. And I think you don't have to have clinical OCD to have a kind of even that subclinical obsessional doubt and compulsive patterning that gets in the way. But when you do, it can really complicate things.
Yeah. Wow. So I wonder if you could maybe just help me understand a little bit more about your basic understanding. I'm sure you could give many hours of discussion on this, but maybe like a little definition of OCD, because it becomes such a commonly used term that people use. And I appreciate now you speaking to kind of subclinical and clinical levels. But is there a way to
Yeah.
kind of say just a little bit about what that means to you when you say it?
Yeah. I feel like it's a really important thing because there's this whole realm of people who actually have obsessive compulsive disorder who are relieved to get a diagnosis. And I know it in the IFS world, we don't always look at things through that lens, and understandably so, right? Because it can be damaging. But with OCD, I think it's really helpful when people know that that's what's happening to them. And that's not all, there's still there's still many people who deal with obsessive compulsive systems and patterns in their system. So what I mean when I say that is, and you're right, how do I pare this down? Because I could talk for hours. If I ever finish my book, I can refer you to that. sorry, when I finish my book.
Yeah.
Obsessions stir up anxiety. So obsessional parts are parts that sound the alarms. They sound an alert. What if this happened? Could that have happened? I'm going to make sure that this didn't touch that. They're managerial, right? They're trying to prevent distress of some kind, and it's not just anxiety. They're trying to prevent disgust, overwhelming, like aversive kinds of feelings or sensations, shame, guilt. I was responsible. I will be responsible if something bad happens. So these kind of obsessional parts stir up anxiety or distress. I call them obsessional because obsessing, what we commonly call obsessing, is actually a compulsion. Because we're in sort of, most people are talking about ruminating about something, and ruminations are designed to decrease anxiety. So compulsions decrease anxiety. They are anything that we do, and it can be a thought, or it can be a ritual, like we commonly see, hand washing or checking. It can be getting reassurance, confessing, or even avoiding. Can compulsively fix the fear that comes up around, what if I get anxious? So it is a reactive kind of decreasing distress kind of tendency. So parts who do compulsions are more firefighters in the IFS world. And if I need to, I assume I'm not going to need to really define managers and firefighters, but proactive parts that decrease anxiety, and reactive part, or proactive parts that increase anxiety, reactive parts that get rid of it. And what happens in OC systems, which is a little different than some other dynamics that we have internally, is that typically, not always, but typically, maybe always, I don't know, most of the time, managers recruit firefighters. They're going to escalate, these obsessional managers anyway, they're going to escalate the alarm until the firefighter fixes the potential of something, or remediates what happened. And so they have a couple of qualities, that those obsessional parts, that they have a very low threshold compared to other people for going off. They're like the car alarm next door that goes off with the wind. And they don't turn off easily. So the compulsions fix it momentarily, but then they go off again.
And they go off again. Interesting. I always get a little confused with the obsessions and the compulsions. And I don't know if there's an example that might come to mind,
Yeah.
just to illustrate that a little bit, maybe even related to sexuality in some way.
Yeah. So the obsession might be something like, there's so many different kinds of ways that it will come up. But a what if thought would be an obsession? What if my feelings aren't really sincere for my partner? What if I don't love my partner in the right way? What if it's not real love? Or what if I'm also attracted to women versus men? Or, uh-oh, this doesn't feel right. What if it's wrong? So those would be kind of obsessional thoughts.
So some parts are producing those thoughts and stirring the pot, so the alarm there is like, be on the alert, like for this terrible thing.
Yeah.
Like if I don't really love my partner, or I'm not right, something isn't right now, that would be terrible.
And what would be the particular flavor of terrible, right? So what if I'm also attracted to women, or I'm not fully into this right now? Well, then that might mean I'm a liar and I'm a bad person and I'm hurting them. Or it might mean something else, right? So any kind of, lots of shame around this. I'm not enough, I'm not right, I'm not good enough, I'm a liar. Or I'm unsafe, right? So what if my partner isn't sincere. It can be partner focused
Mhm.
as well as self focused. Like, what if my
Mhm.
partner, what if I'm not special enough, right? Like, that my partner might have had a similar experience with a previous person, and I can obsess about that. So the feeling that is the feared consequence obviously varies, in very personal ways from
Mhm.
person to person.
Mhm.
And then when that gets overwhelming enough, a compulsive part would come in, right? A firefighter would fix it in some way or another. And it depends on the situation, right? So, walking around making dinner, it might be to go, well, wait a minute. I know this relationship has gone on for a long time, and I know I feel this way, or it does all the rationalizing, or it might review a conversation to make sure that what the partner said was sincere. So it can be just a mental compulsion. In fact, a lot of it is a mental compulsion.
So
In the
that's the
moment,
soothing. Would that be the firefighter in that sense is less extreme, but it's like a soothing rebuttal kind of,
yeah,
but it goes on.
yeah. And it
It's
seems mild, right? The problem is it can be self-like, right? These kinds of firefighters are, we all think about things, excessively from time to time. But if you actually have OCD, it can take up your entire day. It can
mm,
get in the way of work. It can lead to avoiding intimacy because I know if I get close to my partner, all this stuff's going to start happening.
mm,
But it's mental and nobody else knows it's going on.
mhm,
And sometimes people don't even understand that it's OCD, which makes it worse. There's something wrong with me.
mhm,
That kind of shame adds to the whole pile. But firefighters can be, visible as well, and it can result in like giving the partner the third degree. Well, wait a minute. Last time I asked you about this, you said that. Like, are they being honest? Do they really love me? It can be questions about their character, or it could be, I'm focusing obviously in relationship OCD because it seems
mhm,
like that's my
mhm,
brain is sort of lumping these
mhm,
compulsions together. But the compulsive action can be all kinds of things.
mhm,
But when it really interferes in the bedroom is when a person can't get out of their head.
mhm,
And they've got to figure this out and be sure enough that it feels right now, or
mhm,
it is right, or I am close enough, or that they can't really be present.
mhm,
And then oftentimes partners pick up on this and don't
mhm,
understand it either,
mhm.
and it ripples out from there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and it's I have so many different like questions lighting up in me. So yeah, so the first piece is just getting the flavor of there's a dynamic in the way you're talking about OCD, that there's these proactive kind of manager type parts who obsess and might have these kinds of thoughts you gave examples of. And
Mhm.
then there's these other ones that soothe or do engage in certain behaviors or recruit someone else, or enact behaviors, interpersonal behaviors with someone else. And that what differentiates that from the kinds of, I guess, garden variety insecurity someone might feel in their relationship from time to time is that it goes on, it takes up time, it sounds like, and that it can really intrude on intimacy because it takes the person out, as well as I imagine could just create difficult emotional dynamics in the
Yeah,
relationship. Does that
yeah,
sound right?
yeah. That sounds right. And I think it's sometimes really hard to tell, is this OCD or is this normal insecurities? But I'll take reassurance seeking compulsions, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
We all want to feel comfortable and like we might be insecure and we ask a question. We want reassurance from our partner. Do you really love me? Essentially, right? Am I lovable? Am I enough? And that's just really normal. And sometimes there's going to be trauma that's driving that too. So that's often a factor. But with OCD, the reassurance seeking question never gets done being answered. And so it has this really repetitive quality to it. And even the person asking it will be able to say, well, I know we have a great relationship, but I just need to be sure that I'm special enough in this way, or I need to be sure that I just have to ask. And there's this compelled kind of quality to these questions. It isn't as much like, I just don't know. I recently had a client who's had OCD her whole life, been through lots of treatment, really top-notch treatment and intensive out, like she's just done everything. OCD is much better. And now we're using IFS and it's really helping because she says that having OCD your whole life, you really learn to disregard your thoughts because they make trouble. What if this isn't okay? What if, but now I'm stuck with, how do I know if it's that I don't really like this guy? Like, how do I know if I don't really like him, or if that's like a OCD? And that's where IFS is so beautiful, because really helping people unblend from the feeling of these obsessional parts and these compulsive ruminating parts to get a sense of what I want. And OCD is characteristically distinct. Usually, almost always, it doesn't sound like me. I know better. I know is what I want. But OCD just needs to be sure. OCD wants answers to questions that have no answers. Do they love me enough?
So there's like so when people are able to use IFS and for their parts that do the obsessing or the compulsion soften, there's a sense of a different felt, like a discernment, maybe that comes from a different place than what the parts are
Yeah,
seeking. Would that be
yeah, that would be right. So
the flavor of it?
even in a moment, ideally, like, because OCD does have a kind of a neurobiological component in that even if you're really in remission and you don't really suffer from it anymore, thoughts will pop up, their parts will go, what if, uh-oh, yeah, and it might be there. And we know that that's a part, that's part of my internal family. I can be here now, and I don't have to follow it down that path. So, ideally they soften back quite a bit and don't intrude.
Yeah, interesting. So that's that self-led thing,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
That when we can access this, and I'm imagining there are people listening here who are newer to the model. So I'll just say for a minute, we have this idea that we have these different parts of ourselves that take on roles like managing and putting out fires and soothing. And then we also have these vulnerable exiles. And I want to ask you about the role of exiles in this in a moment. But then behind that, we have something that's not a part, that is this what we call self energy, this harmonizing life force, consciousness, whatever you want to call it. People could describe it different ways. That really feels like more authentically and spaciously ourselves, right?
Right.
So when people can access that, maybe these parts are still around, but they don't have the hold over the system,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
it's that felt sense of enough access to self that,
Yeah.
yeah, so helpful.
And then something else in what you said that struck me was this sense that, part seeking reassurance, like a way to tell maybe it's a compulsive part, is it doesn't seem like it's able to take it in. Is that
Right.
right? Like if the partner does the reassuring,
Yeah.
does that soothe it, or for how long before it
Yeah.
needs it again?
Right. And what's confusing about that is a lot of people may have that based on attachment issues and traumas, and it may be hard to really take in certain kinds of communications, and so if we're in a situation of, is this OCD reassurance seeking? Is this compulsive reassurance seeking? Yeah, it has a repetitive quality, even in the moment, or asking the question 5 different ways, or, you know, asking questions that don't have answers. That's not, is this questions that don't have answers, questions that have been answered any number of times, questions that are asked to compare with the last time they were asked. So then this other kind of part comes in that's assessing and comparing answers. OCD has a lot of times a lot of what I call data management kinds of, like, holding on to information collectors, and it's always sort of assessing, is that the right answer? So yeah, it's asking a question just to feel better rather than because I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm noticing, I'm just having different, like, people come to mind who I've met and worked with who have different elements of this. And you started to mention earlier these different kinds of OCD that could all have an impact in the bedroom. You mentioned, I think, contamination OCD. There were some other ones, and I'm just wondering, can you maybe just say what a few of them are, maybe just like a one-liner of sort of what it refers to?
Yeah, well, contamination OCD tends to be the most widely known, more popularized OCD. It's also, oddly enough, one of the least well understood, because a lot of contamination OCD isn't about germs and getting sick. It's about, I might take on a quality of a person, or it's more emotional contamination. So people like to wash the idea of something off of them sometimes. And so they decontaminate, not because they're afraid they're going to get sick, but because it feels dirty. And so sometimes sexuality can have that quality if there's an association with something that feels dirty to me, or feels bad or aversive, that I don't want to take in. There's a sort of I'm too permeable quality to that. So so say, somebody's wearing a color that's associated with a bad memory or a situation that is contaminated, right? Then that might get in the way in the bedroom, right? Something as odd and irrational as that could be a trigger for my OCD if I'm sitting here in this situation. So along with the obvious, right? So if somebody is very germophobic or is very concerned about cleanliness, the sexuality gets messy, right? And that can be a problem. And a lot of times the problem is more wanting to make sure that not to cause harm, right? To want to be clean enough to not harm the other person. So that kind of overlaps with harm OCD, which has to do with issues of responsibility for harming others. Have I been careless in any way that could possibly harm someone? So that could result in a lot of ritual getting prepared to make sure I don't, spread harm. And so yeah, contamination, harm, scrupulosity. So moral scrupulosity and religious scrupulosity are about, not wanting to be a bad person, or not wanting to be, not devout enough in my particular faith, if it's a religious-based scrupulosity. So those kinds of, is it right issues, all of these types overlap. We're humans, so none of it's distinct. So scrupulosity can impact it as well. Is it the right time? Is it the right place? Are we in the right frame of mind to make it okay in a certain
Right.
just part of my system?
Can I share like something, a story, a situation I know I heard about with someone who believed that, sexuality was a very sacred union, between them and their spouse. And then there was always a feeling of this isn't sacred enough. Like we're not, we just had an argument or we just walked the dog and the dog, like there's somehow we can't create a sacred enough container or context. Or maybe we did and we did it anyway and we had sex and now I'm looking back and I'm like we shouldn't have done that because we
Yeah,
weren't pure, we hadn't purified ourselves enough. Would that fit in?
absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, that sacred enough, special enough,
Mhm.
connected enough in
Mhm.
that moment, all of that, those qualities of just rightness can
Mhm.
really get in the way. And,
Mhm.
how do you know when it's just right?
Mhm.
That becomes this rabbit hole
Mhm.
very easily. And what if it's not? And
Right. Yeah. So were there any other types that you were wanting to name that could be
hmm, I
relevant here?
think those are the ones that show up
Mhm.
most often in the realm
Mhm.
of sexuality, as far as I
Mhm.
can. I'll probably
Mhm.
think of something later, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, like
Or well,
that
no,
sexual
actually,
orientation
oh yeah,
OCD or the pedophile OCD. I saw that one
absolutely.
on your website, and I've worked with people who have that one too.
Those are big ones, and then I just thought of something else that flew out of my head. Oh, some people have violent, intrusive, or disturbing sexual intrusive thoughts.
Hmm.
So that kind of content can really impact sexuality as well. But
Hmm.
yes, pedophilia OCD is such a painful type of OCD. There's something wrong with me. And so a lot of compulsions in that type of OCD organize around just being hyper vigilant about, am I aroused right now as I see these kids? It's like really monitoring the body
Hmm.
and keeping like very good control over it. And
Hmm.
so those parts that compulsively do that, might really interfere with a person's ability to really feel comfortable in their body and being
Hmm.
able to enjoy their sexuality. It adds a whole element of shame, right? That there might be something wrong with me. And
Hmm.
then with that comes, do I deserve to enjoy this?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
those kinds of thoughts as well. And then, of course, if you're wondering about your sexual orientation, that can really get in the way, and that overlaps with the relationship OCD, in a
Right.
because that also sort of falls into, well, am I misleading my partner?
Mhm.
Am I hurting them? Because I might actually not know,
Mhm.
you know, that about myself.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So just to flesh these out, just to one more step, like so the pedophilia OCD, just for again, people who might not be familiar, it doesn't mean this is someone who is a pedophile, but that somehow someone has a fear that there's something wrong with them. Would that be right? That there's the thought comes in somehow and then becomes an obsession, and it's not substantiated by their actual
Yeah,
history or their behavior. Would that be accurate?
absolutely. It is, what if, was I was I attracted to that young person?
Mhm.
Like it could start as innocently as that. Is she overage or underage?
Mhm.
I mean, I see a lot of times people will say that. I have this horror, like I found, like I swiped, I don't know what it is, left or right, at a dating app, and then it occurred to me, was she old enough? You
Mhm.
know, And even that can spark a fear of being, somehow creepy or not appropriate. And then, yeah, it can really, it's never, it's a horror of that might be true about me, and I need to check and make sure it's not, and do anything possible, because that would be the worst possible thing I could ever imagine. There is in no way any real desire to do that. It happens, some people have it with animals as well. Like, would I ever get into something like bestiality or in something like too kinky and weird? Is that true about me? Do I like that? Because if, and in any of these domains, say pedophilia, right? Sometimes people have, like, if the key piece is that they know that's not who they are,
Mm-hmm.
and they have this part that's going, but what if you are? And it's that disparity
Mm-hmm.
that creates the problem.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Very painful. People
Yeah.
are in torment, I think, with some of these patterns. Yes. And then with sexual orientation OCD, again, it's not a comment on, right, that sexual orientation can be very
Be very
confusing,
fluid.
right? And we could be very fluid, and we could have parts that are drawn in different ways, or our own orientation could be something that creates some anxiety to sort out, or could present a challenge if we're in a monogamous relationship of one sort and then, feel attraction to other kinds of people. Right. But then the thing, I guess, when I've worked with people that made it feel different was, I worked with one man who had very strong attraction to women, or little, from the time he was a boy to girls. Like, there really wasn't anything in his history that indicated he was attracted to men. But he had a fear, like, what if I'm gay? What if I'm gay? What if I'm gay? And he came from, pretty conservative. He's from a Southern European country, and had come from a conservative Catholic culture. So there was like a lot of what if I, for him, there was a lot of shame and fear of, like, what if I'm gay? What if I'm gay? But it wasn't aligning with his arousal template.
Right. Right.
I think maybe a lover had one time put her finger in his anus, and he had enjoyed that. And that awakened a lot of fear that he was gay. And so when we would try to talk about, well, what if you were, what's your history? Who are you attracted to? What would that mean? It didn't align with just this panicked process that was in his brain, and his whole nervous system just seemed to be in this
Hmm.
anxious, get into this anxious state. And then I
Yeah.
honestly don't remember the ways that he would seek soothing from that exactly, but
Probably a lot of talking to himself about
right.
all the history in his,
Hmm.
relationship history, and
Hmm.
ruminating, probably a lot of figuring it out parts.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of checking. Am I aroused right now, or am I not? Then that kind of interfered with his wife, with whom they had had a
Yeah.
strong sexual attraction, but he was second guessing his attraction.
Mhm.
Or what if, yeah, kind of like to your saying, like, what if I'm not really a good partner for you because I want this other thing? But it was like very hard for me to sense. It was early, this is many years ago, that, like, oh, it, it's, it's just a little different than someone who's purely exploring their sexual orientation.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It has a different um, quality, and a lot of times it's, well, if I were gay, that'd be fine.
Mhm.
But I don't think I am. But every time, I'm with my partner, I have these thoughts. What if I'm gay? What if I'm not right? This isn't right because I want something else, which
Mhm.
is really confusing, right? It's
Yeah.
like, so sometimes there is an actual, well, yeah, there's a different quality than I'm just not sure.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's a lot of it, sometimes it's confusing, like you're saying,
Mhm.
and it changes.
Mhm.
And sometimes there's a level of being okay with that, That's just how the person is, and other times there may not be. But the obsessive compulsive thing
Mm-hmm.
has a very distinctive, uh-oh,
Mm-hmm.
could it be? Does that mean? What does it mean? And well, it doesn't mean this because of that, and we did this and we liked it. And well, let's see. Do we like this? Sometimes people will do a lot of masturbating to imagery to
Mm-hmm.
test. They do a lot of testing,
Mm-hmm.
and then they feel really guilty about it, and that fuels it because the testing's never done.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the same repetitive quality of, like we were talking about with
Mm-hmm.
reassurance seeking, right? To take it into another topic, well, just the reassurance can go on and on and on and on. Like I remember the thing with my daughter was, what if that's a volcano? Are you sure it's not a volcano? How do you know it's not a volcano? Would it be, like for hours, those
Mm-hmm.
questions. So, you know, it has that very, that quality about it.
Like a driven,
That
like
driven again and
can't be,
again.
yeah, it doesn't get reassured or something.
And so
Yeah.
then there is a lot of shame around
Mhm.
that because that
Yeah.
could be quite, you know,
Mhm.
repetitive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in that piece about masturbating to test. And there's such a boundless, endless plethora of things online if people are wondering. And I find that happens a lot too. Someone might have stumbled into some kind of porn that isn't what they naturally
Right.
would think of as part of their arousal template, but the algorithms are pretty good and they
Yeah.
show people lots of stuff, and then someone might get drawn into something that then they feel is like pretty dark or perverse, and then they
Or,
get aroused by it, and
yeah.
then or they wonder if either they get aroused by it or they wonder if they would be aroused by it, but then if they're like, am I or aren't I? And then
Yeah.
so actually, then this leads to the question of that you mentioned briefly, the neurobiology. So, like, what would be the difference between someone who's like, oh, I got turned on by something that's morally distressing to me or distasteful to me. Now I
Mhm.
feel bad about it, but I'm still kind of attracted to it because it was arousing. How is
Right.
that different than someone who gets into what you would
Well,
call OCD?
mhm. Right.
So I guess it's a matter of degree or something.
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of conversation around what's the difference between OCD and addiction, for instance.
Mhm.
So if one, like with computer games and things like that too, you find people that get sucked into repetitive, just because it's a repetitive behavior doesn't mean it's a compulsion, right?
Mhm.
With OCD, the idea is, and of course, again, it's not an absolute, but
Mhm.
compulsions do not bring pleasure in any way. Nobody wants to does compulsions because they want to, because there's some arousal and it feels good, and I'm drawn to it, and I can't wait to go home and do this thing. The nature of compulsions is they have to happen to relieve the incredible distress I'm feeling that won't go away, won't let me enjoy life or be present until I fix it.
Mhm.
So I have to go home and I have to find out if this particular thing turned me on. I have to,
Mhm.
nobody wants to get out of bed for the 30th time in the middle of the night and wash their hands again,
Mhm.
even though they're bleeding, right? It's
Mhm.
that kind of, I don't want to have to do this again.
Mhm.
But I know that I won't be able to concentrate on my homework. I won't be able to
Mhm.
be present with my kids. I won't be able to get my job done until I just do that compulsion
Mhm.
so I can calm myself.
Interesting. So
So
there's a
that's,
real lack of pleasure, might
yeah,
be one distinction,
that's a distinction. Yeah.
and a
Yeah.
real work, almost like work, a lot of work. It's like
Yeah.
it's very like a big
That's right.
job. Those
Work
parts are
hard,
working super hard. Yeah.
working hard, really responsible,
Yeah. Yeah.
really terrified that if something bad happens and they didn't work that hard, it would be their fault.
Mhm.
Lots of,
Yeah.
yeah.
So again, I'm just very fascinated here. And I was starting to ask, I think, about the neurobiology, what role that plays. And then I'm going to write down my other question uh, just so I don't forget it, but I won't ask you too many questions at once.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
maybe start with, what is that element?
Yeah. Yeah, so the neurobiology has to do with a certain brain circuit that we now kind of have identified, and we don't really know entirely how this works, and we also are beginning to find that it's different in different people, in different types of OCD, like early onset OCD with tics tends to be more genetically predisposed, and there's lots of information coming out, but essentially there's a particular brain circuit that is our warning system. And that tends to have a very low threshold for firing an alert, And I was talking about it in one of my consultation groups the other day as being, this is like data. This is like ones and zeros. It's like raw data, like, uh-oh, like there's no content really to it. It's like something's off.
Mm.
Neuroception,
Mhm.
it's just, and that fires, and it fires a sense of distress. It's a distress signal. So OCD, and then the other piece of it is that it doesn't have a done button. So we can fix it, but then but am I sure I fixed it? Am I sure I know? There's this doubt that comes in, and it never kind of feels, not never, it takes a long time for till some magic happens and it feels done. So the way that translates is then the parts will kind of grab that data and assign a meaning to it, or a feared outcome to it. And it kind of tells a story about what that could mean, and that kind of creates the particular distress. And
Mm.
yeah.
So,
Is that,
so some people, would you say, have more of a genetic predisposition to having that sensitive
yes,
alarm?
highly heritable. It's like, I don't know, I can't remember, I'm bad with numbers and statistics, but
Mhm.
more than 40% like genetic in twin studies. And
Mhm.
so you do find a lot of, that's usually kind of one of the things I ask when I'm trying to figure out, is this OCD or not, is, do you have any family members with OCD?
Mhm.
Because oftentimes there are. And
Mhm.
then, and the other piece with the issues in terms of related to sexuality, is this OCD or is this other stuff? Is there
Mhm.
OCD in any other domains of life? Usually it will crop up. Well, I do these things too.
Mm. So it would
That,
normally, if it was OCD, it might be presenting in more different
yeah,
realms.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. So there's some heritability. Well then, so then what about trauma?
yeah.
Right. So not to that, and I don't expect you to like have all the answers on all of this and have it all figured out, but I'm just appreciating so much your depth of experience with all of this. So, someone who's had trauma may have a system
Right.
that's very sensitive and reactive.
Yeah.
The other piece I'll add in here was I was wondering about exiles because we were talking about managers and firefighters, and then you were talking about how like the fears of those managers, or maybe that I'm bad or I'm shameful or I'm a terrible person or I would harm someone and then I would be a terrible person.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering about kind of how exiles fit in and then trauma.
Well, let's do trauma and then exiles.
Okay. Okay.
Trauma, in the OCD, community, people are pretty clear that trauma does not cause OCD.
Hmm.
So even if there is a traumatic event, and often there is, that seems to be a precursor that sparks it, um, the obsessing and compulsing around that occur because the OCD brain grabs a hold of it in a certain way
Hmm.
and discovers, oh, if I do this compulsion, it settles down. Let's do that again. Oh, okay, if I just do that, it feels better. And then that behavior, that obsessive compulsive behavioral loop
Mhm.
that we see parts do, develops and kind of builds steam and becomes more intractable and extreme. But Do we know that for sure?
Mm.
No, trauma can be the precursor, and it depends on how you define trauma and all of those kinds of things. What we know about, and okay, two thoughts at the same time. I'm going to set one over here, which don't forget to ask me if I forget. I would say that OCD is protector driven more than exile driven because of this trauma reason, which is why I wanted to start here.
Mhm.
But there are things like brain trauma, right? So
Mhm.
traumatic brain injury,
Mhm.
we could call it trauma, and then PANS and PANDAS, and all of the new information about inflammation in the brain. So
Wait a
PANS,
minute. Can you, yeah, are you going to say what those are? Okay.
define those. So pediatric PANDAS, I'll start there because that's what began my whole journey into OCD land. Was one day my daughter woke up at 8 years old with sudden onset severe OCD.
Mm.
Like overnight, she's a different kid.
Hmm.
So, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with strep, PANDAS. She had had a
With
strep
strep.
infection.
Oh my goodness. Mhm.
It was treated, antibiotics went away. Her fever spiked one night and then was gone the next day, so we didn't do anything about it. I think that happened twice. But she was fine. She got better. I don't know, 6, 8 weeks later, this happened. She woke up one day with all this fear about food. And it, at that point, they were calling it a controversial diagnosis because of some research spat, but
Hmm.
that happens. And I didn't know anything about OCD really. I'd been a therapist for 15 years, so I had a lot of parts that thought I should know how to handle it, but
Mhm.
I didn't. But I learned a lot. And now we know there's also PANS, which basically is now an overarching umbrella that includes any strong immune system response. Originally, they found it with Lyme disease and other things like that.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
if you see a sudden onset with a
With the
child,
child, so that could be related to
want to
infection.
get the immune system,
Yeah.
and there's a
Wow.
big autoimmune connection here,
Hmm.
and more information is coming out now about inflammation and mental health.
Oh,
So
how
there's that
interesting.
piece too. So
Yeah.
if you want to put that under the trauma umbrella, brain trauma
Mm.
can cause
Mhm.
OCD. And I'm going to flip it really fast here also and say the big trauma piece in OCD is that OCD causes trauma. Having OCD is traumatic for people.
Mm.
And more, as I'm seeing people come to me now for IFS for OCD, I'm hearing, these parts scare my little ones. And because
Their own
their
internal
own
exiles, so their own young parts. Is that what you're
young,
saying? Their own internal young parts are scared of their own internal obsessing and compulsing parts. Okay.
because these obsessing and compulsing parts might be gathering information from a brain glitch, right? But they'll have intrusive images that are just horrible, that don't make any sense to their system. And oftentimes they did not arise out of a trauma, and like with PANS and PANDAS. And so it's very confusing for the system. And I think part of the reason why it's very hard to get obsessive and compulsive parts to stop is that these exiles keep getting scared and traumatized and reburdened
Mm.
by the process of OCD itself.
Oh, so interesting. I actually had a consultee this morning who didn't know I was talking with you today, who said, I want to ask some questions about OCD, and asked if there's always an exile. If OCD can happen because of the neurochemistry, and if there's always a wounded young part, perhaps related to a trauma, for there to be OCD. I thought it was such a great question, and now I have a chance
Great question.
to
Yeah,
ask
I
you.
think there's always, and I hate saying always with, but it seems like there may always be an exile, maybe not always a burdened, a burden that's driving this
Mhm.
in particular. But hang on, my answer to that. Oh, that exiles tend to be a little bit different. Like they may not carry that conviction, I'm bad, or I am, the burdens of exiles are typically beliefs.
Mhm.
Their convictions and their stuck feelings um, that a part takes on or comes to believe about itself. In OCD, sometimes and this is again, this is totally theoretical, right?
Mhm.
But what I'm seeing with clients a lot of times is it's an uncertainty. It's a what if, am I bad? So I feel like exiles might have a little different quality in OCD sometimes.
Mm.
And the real issue is more the protectors. It is a highly the I believe that it's that alliance between the manager and the firefighter.
Mm.
They may not like each other too, but the obsessions are going to keep going until this guy jumps in, until the firefighter jumps in. So
Mhm.
I think because there's this little subsystem quality to OCD
Mhm.
that's what makes it very difficult to work with.
Mm.
And yeah, it is a good
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Wow. So then let's talk about what could someone do, if they have noticed that they do have some of these OCD patterns. And, there's the IFS world where often we're trying to first befriend the protectors and then heal and unburden the exiles.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's not so much exile burdens, I'm curious
Mm-hmm.
about that. And then I know there's other, more researched and validated treatments for OCD.
Yeah.
So yeah, can you comment at all how you would help someone who came to see you with maybe a sexually based OCD symptom or
Yeah.
pattern?
Yeah, that the evidence-based treatment for OCD is exposure and response prevention, which is basically exposing yourself to this scary situation and preventing your rituals, right? So it has a bad name. It doesn't have to always be this horrible, harsh, licking toilet seats and kind of behavioral methodology that I think people think of it as. It can be a very deep and very transformational and beautiful thing when it's done that way.
Mhm.
And I really believe that it is actually essentially what we are already doing in IFS, which is that we are relating to our protective parts, developing that self-to-part relationship so that those protective parts that are doing the rituals learn to see self
Mhm.
and learn to trust self. Now, sometimes I believe that you can really, maybe because I'm more comfortable doing that exposure kind of model, sometimes we do little experiments and we ask that protector, would it be willing to let self give it a try without the ritual?
Mhm.
What if we were to go and, you know, with mental rituals, it's a little harder, but say it's a ritual kind of cleaning before a sexual encounter or something
Mhm.
like that.
Mhm.
Would that part be willing to let yourself, change that up a little, do a little less, do it a little differently, and see how that goes? And so that can develop a self-to-part relationship. Or to have, would that part be willing to let you like have a certain image in your mind or look at a certain picture
Mhm.
and not ritualize it, not remediate it in some way,
Mhm.
and see how that is, see what comes up. And then parts will come up, right? Exiles may come up. Then we really tend to those parts. Like we do IFS in the same way that we would do it anywhere else,
Hmm.
right? It's befriending that part. There are some caveats and some things to look out for in that these parts will really like to get you into a conversation about why what they're saying is really important and getting, extra careful not to get into the content.
Hmm.
We're befriending the part. We're not validating its arguments and engaging in getting entangled in its
Hmm.
content.
Mhm.
That's the caveat, but I really think that what we're doing in IFS is the same. We turn towards these parts.
Mm-hmm.
especially the ones that OCD is trying not to have.
Mm-hmm.
We basically, with that openness and self-led quality, and we sort of help the system learn something new, which is we can have that part as part of our experience. We can be uncertain, right? We cannot know for sure if this is right or sacred or clean or safe, or
Mm-hmm.
we can have that not knowing.
Wow. Yeah, it's so powerful. And imagine then there's like polarization. So you're kind of, having to help different parts in this, those managers that push the alarm bells. I
Yeah.
imagine there would need to be befriending with those parts too.
Yeah,
Um,
then there's the whole outer layer of parts that react to OCD and hate it and want it to go away,
mhm.
or doubt, is this really OCD, or am I actually just a terrible person?
Yeah. Oh my
So there's
goodness.
another
Yeah.
layer. It can be quite complex. I think one of the challenges, especially with sexuality, is that clients will say, well, we were in the bedroom and this was going on and all these parts were coming up, and I tried to check in with my parts while we are and like in the moment it's very difficult to stop and
Hmm.
chat with your parts and stay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
it does require that practice, that ongoing work that we do in terms of
Hmm.
um, maybe not in the moment work at first.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it may involve partners too.
Yes, that was another thing. And I know we'll need to wind down soon. I feel like we could talk for ages, but that's a whole big thing too of how OCD might impact partners who may have their own OCD, or it might just be the all the stress that can happen in a relationship, even for an aspect of OCD that doesn't have direct sexual
Right.
manifestations, but living with someone who has OCD can cause stress in a relationship, feeling perhaps not seen or responded to in a relaxed and fluid, you know, attuned way, perhaps. Or there's just other ways that those
Right.
behaviors can cause tension in a relationship.
Partners and all family members get pulled into accommodating OCD,
Hmm.
which essentially means they're doing compulsions for and with their family member who has it because
Mm.
that settles things down. So,
Oh, interesting.
yeah,
So, yeah, helping to avoid the triggers or the.
yeah, yeah. And in sexuality scenarios, that could involve I know I don't say a certain thing or do a certain thing, which can be respectful and wonderful.
Mhm.
And, there's bigger conversations to be had
Mhm.
around that. I mean, it can be
How
part of,
restrictive that could become for the partner, maybe, or yeah.
yeah, and not accommodating OCD is actually, when done with communication and gradually and in the proper ways. I'm not advocating don't accommodate OCD ever, but it can be very healing.
Hmm.
That's, it's helping a person really face their fears.
Mhm.
And so that can be an actually really beautiful bonding part of, a relationship. And so, that it can be a good thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, I love that.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm just curious for listeners to check in with themselves for a minute and just see what is getting stirred. If you've been with us throughout this really rich conversation, just to kind of notice what's drawn your interest. What do you notice in your own body or in your own inner landscape, listening to this conversation? Maybe some of it is reminding you of something or getting you curious. And, as you do that, I guess just wanting to ask you, Melissa, if there's anything more you want to share with us. I totally feel like we could do a follow up at some point. But anything that you want to name, and then afterward, maybe tell us a little more about kind of where you're going with this and what's on the horizon for you.
Uh, well, I agree with you. I think we could talk for another hour. There's all these different topic areas, these little pods of conversation. So, welcoming the questions. I'm always aware that somebody listening who has OCD may be triggered by some of the things that we talked about, and I I feel like I just like to name that, I have a lot of compassion for that. Sometimes these topic areas are hard, and it might even be something, it's just very easy. It might be something mundane that we don't even realize, we just sort of can't prevent those things from happening, but I care about it. I have this part that just wants to name it because, it's OCD is a challenge. And so I guess I've got thoughts about that and feelings because I live with someone with OCD, or I did, and
Mm.
I do. And I can see, it ebbs and flows. And I just hope people get help, if they're struggling.
Mhm. Mhm.
So there's that. And I think in terms of we covered a lot of the basic bases. So
Mhm.
I appreciate your great questions.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you. And I just really appreciate you speaking to listeners who may be really struggling in this area, and that naming something, like you said, can be helpful. Recognizing something can be helpful, but it also can,
Yeah.
sometimes,
Yeah.
be a lot. So just always encourage self-care and
Yeah.
kindness and gentleness and patience with yourself or maybe other people in your life who are working with this. And if people wanted to learn more about your work, Melissa, or maybe even reach out to you, can you share a little more
Yeah,
information?
absolutely. My website, I think I gave that link to you for
You
the
did. That will all be in the show notes as well.
so melissamosmft.com. I do workshops from time to time. I do consultation groups, and working on making those easier to find on my website. I think that the other thing that's I've got a book for clinicians that is close to done, and I'm working on a workbook for individuals with OCD that will be, done next year, I believe, as well. So I've got those two things going on. I will also be doing a workshop through the OCD training school, like more of a training of how to. So that's happening as well. And I have an interest list going for a kind of a coaching group for individuals with OCD as soon as I get approved for getting more hours in my work week. I really am wanting to do something like that as well. But yeah, sign up for the newsletter. I send it out not real frequently, but when something's coming up, I do send out a newsletter,
Mhm.
and you can always inquire through my website, and I'm happy to get emails and answer questions.
That's fantastic. I'm so excited to read your book and so inspired by all the things that you're trying to get out there. And it's such an important topic. And just grateful to have had this time together with you. So thank you so much for being on the Self-Led in Bed podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self-energy. Until next time.